I'm Joe Hicks, and I'm here at the Reagan Ranch, where we caught up with Governor Scott Walker to ask him about the recall effort in that state, as well as his battle with public employee unions and a bunch of other kind of things we thought you'd want to hear from him. Governor, you gave the keynote address here for the Young America's Foundation event here at the Reagan Ranch in Santa Barbara. And I guess the question to you, after talking to a sizable group of young conservatives, how do you feel about the future of conservatism, talking to a bunch of young conservatives? Are you encouraged by your interaction with them?
Yeah, absolutely. And I have been for some time, but to see folks from all across the country here, young people who are inspired, who want to hear about the Reagan legacy, but then more importantly, really kind of apply it to the future. I've said time and time again, in order to move forward, you have to understand the past. And this is a great experience for these young people to really build off of the legacy of President Reagan.
Let's move to some of the national political issues. Recently, voters in Ohio overturned the law there that limited the ability of public employees to collectively bargain. I guess I'd like to know what your read is on that outcome in Ohio on other issues, particularly the kind that you're facing in your state.
Well, a night-and-day difference between Ohio and Wisconsin, even though the law is very similar to what we've enacted in Wisconsin. The difference was in Ohio, when they put that ballot initiative on as a referendum, they stopped the law from going into effect. Unlike in Wisconsin, where now for months, even after the court challenges, we've seen the positive impact in terms of saving hundreds of millions of dollars for our schools, our local government, and our state budget now being balanced. All of those things are going to be reinforced this December when our property taxes are essentially frozen. In Ohio, they didn't have any of that. So the difference between hearing about the negative effects and not having anything to counter it versus Wisconsin, where despite all the rhetoric, the facts are the facts, and the facts are the reforms are working.
Now, you certainly held firm in Wisconsin, but do you think the vote in Ohio might affect some other governors who are also facing similar kind of economic issues and, dealing with public employee unions and collective bargaining issues, although certainly New Jersey, out here in California, et cetera, et cetera. Do you think it might cause some to pull back a little bit in their battles with public employee unions?
I think it really largely depends on what happens in the recalls in Wisconsin. The attempt, at least in the next couple months against me, if somehow that was successful, then I have no doubt about it. But I think in Ohio's case, if the measure lost there, and most people agree largely for the reason I mentioned, which is because the law didn't go into effect, if we uphold not only me, but the legislative majorities in the state assembly and state senate, Wisconsin, even after the tens of millions of dollars thrown at our legislative candidates against me, I think most folks, even those in other parties, I mean, remember, it's not just myself and Kasich and other Republican governors. You've got, even of late, Jerry Brown talking about pension reform. You've had Andrew Cuomo talking about New York. You even have Rahm Emanuel, the mayor of Chicago, talking about it in the city of Chicago.
Yeah. Now, it's interesting because Americans have always upheld the right of workers to collectively bargain. So explain, if you could, to our viewers, what is there that's different about government employees, public employees, that makes that a different sort of situation?
Well, it really is. And mistakenly, people talk about collective bargaining rights for public employees. They aren't rights, they're an expensive entitlement. And even people like Franklin Delano Roosevelt talked about that. He said there's a big difference, so it's not just conservatives, there's a big difference between public employees versus private sector employees. In the private sector, unions had a rightful place. Certainly employees should have a right to choose, but at a rightful place in terms of balancing off work conditions, hours, wages, things like that. In the public sector, the government would only be protecting itself from itself because the government's the one that regulates all these entities. So where in the private sector, OSHA and other standards have protected private sector employees, in the public sector, it's a vicious cycle. Taxpayers' money is used to pay public employees, which is right, for wages and benefits, but part of that money goes to union dues. Those union dues then go to unions, who then use that to fund political candidates who support spending more money on more government and more public employee wages and benefits. That's a vicious cycle. The debate in Ohio, the debate in Wisconsin, the debate elsewhere, really when it comes to the money that the national big government unions are spending, is not about wages, it's not about pension or health care payments. It's ultimately about them wanting to continue forced enrollment in a public employees union. We said we're going to leave that up to workers to choose, and that's what the fight's about.
Now, you mentioned the recall movement. You just mentioned the vast amounts of money that public employee unions are going to bring to the table in that effort. There's going to be almost a national, nationally orchestrated campaign there. And they've got an axe to grind against you. How do you plan to really contend with that and deal with that to come out the other end in the kind of shape that you need to.
We think if we get the truth out, I have great faith in the American people, and in my case, I have great faith in the people in Wisconsin. I believe that when the truth is presented, when they see the facts, again, unlike Ohio, where they actually can see that it works. I've got 2 kids who go to public school. September 1, when they and every other kid in our state went back to school, most parents like me saw that our schools were the same or better. In December, long before there'd be a recall vote, most taxpayers in our state paying property taxes will see their bills are the same or lower. I don't care how many tens of millions of dollars outside groups from outside of our state spend. In the end, people have seen the facts. They've seen the reforms working, and you can try and convince them of things, but I just believe in the end, just like it did in August, when, for example, we had 6 Republican senators who were outspent, in many cases 2 to 1, almost 3 to 1, in some instances, and still won, is because voters looked at the facts, and the facts show time and time again the reforms are working.
Now, Governor, recently in Chicago, at an event you were speaking at, the Occupy Wall Street folks crashed your event, made a big display. It's now all over YouTube, people watching this. Give me your feeling for these Occupy Wall Street folks, at least the movement, not the people in particular. What's your feeling about this movement? Do you think there's anything there that we need to really pay attention to, or is there something else that they represent?
Well, I think it's a combination of things. I think there are some people legitimately concerned about the economy, about what's happening. In some ways, as odd as this sounds, I don't think that completely removed from some of the people who in the last couple of years have been in the Tea Party movement who are upset about where things are headed. In one case, a lot of the Tea Party participants are more upset with the bureaucracy of government run amok. Some of these folks legitimately concerned in the current movement are kind of concerned about the bureaucracy in big corporate America. In both cases, very similar. But I think what you've seen, and we saw it in Wisconsin in the protest that accelerated after our reforms were brought to light, is that you have others piling on, spending money to pay people to come in to be a part of these movements to try and draw attention away from other things. And I think part of the attention trying to be drawn away from is the fact that more government spending has failed in terms of a stimulus. If you truly want to get the middle class back to work, you don't do it by more government spending like the president and others have pushed. You do it like President Reagan did a generation ago. You put more money back in the hands of the American people. That's the debate out there. That's the discussion. But I do think it's important to understand that many people are concerned. They're afraid. They're bothered about where this country is headed. The question is, you don't put more people to work by angry mobs. You put them to work by a positive plan, a positive outlook, and by allowing the private sector, the people who've built this country, ultimately have more of the power, not the government.
Now, your reference to angry mobs leads me to ask you your thoughts on what we've seen taking place, let's say in Greece, where there has been really a lot of violence, and some of the same kind of issues about public employee unions and entitlements and that sort of thing. Do you think there's any chance of seeing that kind of violence in this country that may be related to the Occupy Wall Street stuff? Perhaps not. But do you think there are any similarities there?
Well, there could be. I hope there's not. I've said even in our state, which historically has been politically very divided, not just in light of the collective bargaining, but the last couple elections prior to 2008, we were the closest blue state in the country. So razor-thin margins out there. And this country's been relatively divided politically. But I think there are core things that unite us. People wanting to live the American dream, people wanting to care about passing on a country that's greater than the country they inherited, people about wanting to see everyone be lifted up and do better. Those, I think, are common themes. The question is, how do you get there? And my hope is that in America, we still have that kind of respect. The irony is, many of these protests we see, talk about wanting to be heard, but as I saw in one of those protests when they barged in, they don't want others to be heard. To me, I have no fear. I said in the midst of our protests, when there were tens of thousands of people around the Capitol, I said they have every right to be heard. That's what's great about America. But I also made it clear that their voices weren't going to drown out the 5.5 million taxpayers in my state, the majority of whom voted for me to fix the budget, to do it without raising taxes, and to do it in a sane way that provided long-term structural relief. I still believe there's enough Americans out there that want us in each of our states to make decisions that think more about the next generation than they do about the next election. And I think that will happen despite the protest out there.
Now, speaking of the next election, you're clearly one of the Republicans that the nation has been kind of watching for a number of reasons. So I can't let you go without asking you just what some of your thoughts are in terms of the upcoming election and how you feel about what you see taking place within the debates and the chances that, in fact, the current president might be unseated come 2012.
Well, I think there's no doubt when you've had historically this kind of a meltdown in the economy, typically Americans look to the president And if the economy has continued to falter, they look for someone new. It's what happened with Jimmy Carter when President Reagan won in 1980. Historically, it would be very likely that would happen again here. I think the key will be for whomever the Republican is, it can't just be an anti-agenda.
Yeah.
I think Americans want to know that they have a leader who's got a plan, who's got a way of moving this country forward. And I think whomever amongst the Republicans does the best job of charting out a vision, creating a little bit of a morning in America, again, like President Reagan did, I think the clearer, more concise that individual can be, the more likely they are to be elected as the next president. Because I know in our case, in Wisconsin, we faced last year very similar circumstances. What people wanted more than anything, we charted out a course to help the people, not the government. But the people in my state create 250,000 jobs. People gravitated towards that. We're still focused on that every day, every week, every month. That's been our focal point along with balancing our budget. And I think people want the same thing out of their next chief executive for the country.
Well, Governor Walker, I know you have a very busy schedule, and I appreciate taking a few minutes to sit and talk with us. Thank you again very much for being with me today. Appreciate it.
My pleasure. Good to be with you.